Welcome to another edition of Cults and the Culting of America podcast. My name is Scott Loyd. I'm joined by knitting cult lady Daniela Mestenek Young. And as we're recording this, it is Veterans Day in the United States. So I think it's fitting. Daniela, thank you for your service. Well, you deserve much more than that, but I'm glad that at least you got that, right? So thank you. And we're glad to have Emily Hulen joining us tonight. And Emily, why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. So my name, well done. You pronounced my last name correctly.
Good, good. That's a
I'm Emily
first.
Hulen. Yes, very much so. So my name is Emily Hulen. I am professionally a massage therapist and trauma coach, specializing like how the body holds trauma. And then my personal journey, my personal life, I was raised in a cult, being Christian Science. And then I was also raised within several others because, as Daniela is very fond of mentioning, no one leaves a cult and doesn't go into another. And then once I was fully out of those spaces, I still ended up in some cult-like spaces with lots of really sketchy behaviors that were not inherently cults themselves. And now I am just working in spaces of activism and being very careful not to fall down a cult spiral within that.
Thank you so much, and we're really glad that you're here. And why don't you take a moment, just for our sake and for the sake of our listeners, tell us a little bit what is Christian Science, and maybe in a nutshell, kind of get us up to speed on that particular.
Yeah, so very broadly, Christian Science is itself a technically religious organization. They do claim to be a religious organization. It is dying, as many cults do. And it was started by Mary Baker Eddy, who was a woman, one of the rarities. And she created this idea based off of a bunch of different ideas from people that she would then later down the road cease to acknowledge her connection to. The idea that our current reality is not a reality, it's a myth or a dream of some form, and so anything you're feeling or experiencing here and now in your physical mortal body is just a figment of your imagination. So that kind of dovetailed with the idea that no going to doctors was acceptable and that medicine itself was kind of evil, though they don't really have a devil figure. So that resulted in a lot of abuses around like medical neglect and emotional abandonment and stuff like that in my childhood, and which is a very common theme for many people who survive Christian Science.
Was this a group that you were born into, or was it introduced to you later in life?
No, I was born into it. My genetic lineage, on my father's side, I have 3 or 4 generations of being Christian Science. So it goes back to my great great grandparents, which is probably somewhere in the ballpark of when it started. Because of the lack of doctor information, we don't really have a great line on the lineage either.
Was this something that did it prove problematic for your parents and obviously for you? What were some of those early indications that this was not a healthy group?
Yeah. So yes, it did, and still does in many ways. So my parents, I don't have contact with them anymore. I ceased contact in 2020, partially because they are still very much involved in the cult ideology, and partially because of just also their treatment of me as a person. Within that, my mother has diabetes, and it went untreated for roughly 20 years because of Christian Science. And part of that created her now far more significant medical issues. So she's at the point now, a decade or so after being diagnosed, that she's functionally blind and
Goodness.
oftentimes having significant medical issues. And then my father also, we presume, has had several strokes and such. We don't really properly know because, again, lack of medical care.
Yeah, the earlier iterations of the group that I was involved in, they were more like the Christian Science folks in that they wouldn't go to doctors, didn't believe in modern science and medicine and things of that nature. but it sort of evolved over time. So by the time that I came along, it was more accepted. But there was still, they always looked sideways at experts and at doctors and things of that nature. And so that was certainly something that proved problematic for me growing up. But in your case, it absolutely aggravated already existing medical problems and issues. How did that impact your life? I'm assuming when your parents are suffering, you're suffering as well.
Yeah, very much so. So, my own personal experience, I had what I presumed to have been swine flu at 16. This was back in like 2008 ish. And I only believe that because my boyfriend did go to the doctor at the time and he was diagnosed and hospitalized for a while. What that resulted in, because I was 10 when I was like, oh, this is, this is
Yeah,
all, this is all garbage.
good for you.
Thank you. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was 16 and was running a 104, 105 fever. And that was kind of the point at which like I had access to the internet, which I can also credit frankly for being part of my extrication from being in the cult ideology. But I googled, at what point do you have brain damage from a fever? And that was kind of the point at which I acknowledged like, oh, I might have a problem here and I might have to call 911 for my own physical safety. And then instead called a friend and got smuggled baby aspirin. And so that helped bring my fever down. And that is an example. I also, at 7, I worked, in a volunteer space with horses. I had my spine stepped on by a horse, never
Oh,
saw medical treatment. Yeah, numerous concussions. Also at 15 or 16, was a passenger in a Jeep that rolled 5 times at a roughly 70 or 80 miles an hour and never saw medical treatment for that.
So
Was
would
never
they
vaccinated.
would they pray for you when these accidents and things happened, or were there alternative
Yeah.
treatments? How did that look like?
So there were never alternative treatments. The way I often put it in shorthand is that anything from ice on a burn to cancer treatment is considered medicine.
wow.
The problem, yeah, it's insane. The problem with the way that they would handle things is that another way I've phrased it to my therapist is that being raised in Christian Science was very much the codification of structural dissociation because you had to dissociate from your experience so thoroughly as to be an ethereal being. Like you were not actually a person having an experience. You were mistaken and being fooled by error that or mortal mind that you were a being with a body and an experience. You were actually a spiritual entity who was being fooled. So
And
prayer is the shorthand that they use. I'm sorry, Danielle.
no, this is, you might have covered this when I dropped off, but this is kind of at the heart of what Christian scientists believe, right? Is that basically nothing is real. Nothing is real. Everything's a construct. And so it's all in your head, basically another version of that.
Yeah, yeah, basically, the another way to put it is like you are actively at this moment. It is heaven on earth. Any physical experience you're having that is not good is error, mortal mind trying to convince you. They don't really have a nefarious devil entity, but it's largely the same using a different term. And so the idea is that when you go to pray, you are not so much asking for like an intermediary or like intervention from God. You are cleaning the window. It's like the window or the mirror has gotten dirty by your mortal experience and you just need to clean it by remembering that you are a child of God who is perfect in every way. And then in heaven, there is no sin, disease, or death. And therefore, this is heaven on earth. So there's no sin, disease, or death here. So any perception that you have of sin, disease, or death is actually just your brain lying to you.
Another version of blaming the individual for systemic problems. This is one of those things that I find in basically every situation of coercive control, because you have to keep the individuals thinking that everything is on them. I kind of feel like it's what the culture does to us with recycling, like the gaslighting of splitting things up into cans when they're just like pumping toxins into the environment and all the billionaires have jets. And it's like, but if you keep the individuals like always striving for some kind of purity, some kind of perfection, that's never really attainable because the system is broken. But that is what makes cult members keep going.
Yeah, it is. And it was as a very young child, because I think while you were out, I mentioned this, that I mentally left at 10. But of course, still being raised by my parents, didn't get out till about 19. The thing that happened is that you double down. So anytime you think you're having a problem, you actually just double down on it and try harder. And then there was a point at which I just went, "Oh, this isn't working. Maybe it's."
And so, what were some of those red flags that you became aware of, and when did you become aware of them? You said you had this epiphany at 10.
Yeah.
What triggered that?
So my, local congregation was maybe 15 people strong at its largest. Like, the cult was dying for a long time before me coming along, and part of that meant that my father ended up being my Sunday school teacher for a while, and I discovered at some point I could just use their rhetoric against them and not have to participate really. So I would take naps in Sunday school, like, literally put my head down on the table, and then my father would be like, "What's the answer to this thing?" This, like, problem that he would make up as a possibility, and I would come out of my stupor and go, "Because God is love," and I just go back to sleep. And there was a point at which, like, he got mad because every answer did pretty much boil down to that or a similar statement. And so, inevitably, my brain was able to think of other things, and having access to the internet meant that I could ask questions. And I was also being homeschooled. That's another factor in my cult upbringing. The scholastic system that we were using was called Calvary, and it's a secular system. And they taught, as one of the electives, Greek mythology. And I was like, "Oh, wow, there's a lot of similarities between the way these people perceive God and Zeus." And then I was like, "Well, what makes this one different from Zeus?" "Oh, barely anything." And so then it was like, well, if Zeus is bull and just a story people have told over and over, then maybe this is too. And then from that point, I just started poking holes, and I realized, like, oh, my parents did not have good answers. And one of the things about Christian Science is that, much to Daniela's point elsewhere about cults sometimes following an ideology, not just a person, that is one of the things that Christian Science did, is that when she died, her book, Science and Health, is what became the standard. So the book itself is just word salad. So you go to look up, like, what does this mean? It is just gibberish.
Yeah.
I love it though, not gonna lie. I think one of the basic cult baby skills, at least for so many of us, is like learning how to the and
Yeah.
like, when people ask me, like when my co-writers from Unculture were like, "But how? Like, how did you go to high school and like survive?" And I was just like, I'm really good at telling the teacher what they want to hear. Like that is one of
Yeah,
my basic skills is like skimming,
absolutely.
reading the tops, and then giving back to them exactly what they want. And it was interesting to see that even kind of work in a college classroom and that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
later on in life. and not always in the bullshitting way, but just having that skill of being like, okay, what's the answer that they want me to find here? And then how do I, package
Yeah.
that and give that back to the teacher in the way that they want to hear it?
I'm actually going back and I have finally gotten the time to actually listen to this podcast I'm an honored guest on, and I went back to the very beginning, and one of the things you said very early on is how you got through college was just 3 more paragraphs of and I was like, "Oh, I deeply feel that sentiment."
That was my rule. Whenever I didn't know if I had quite nailed the answer, it was like, just write 3 more paragraphs and just like say more, say
Yeah,
it again. And yeah.
pretty much.
So, Emily, when you started to extricate yourself from this particular group, what did that process look like? Was there conflict within your family? How did that go? You had that sort of understanding at age 10. Fast forwarding, what did that look like through your teen years?
Yeah, so at 10, I figured it out, and right around 11, my uncle and my aunt decided to also leave separately, and that was a family secret. We can't really talk about it because, of course. Now, Christian Science is incredibly insular, but we did have, external factors, like, my cousins went to public school, everyone had working jobs, out in the regular normie life. So, my uncle and aunt left, meaning they told my grandmother, the matriarch of that side of the family where the cult comes from, that they were leaving, that they weren't gonna be going to church whenever they came to visit her or us or anything like that. And one of the things that also exists separately from being raised in Christian Science is I was also raised very much in what I now understand to have been a family cult, where my mother was more of the cult leader and my father was her follower. And what that meant is that my labor was exploited pretty thoroughly. And one of the ways that happened was massaging her, like helping with her pain. Because while we can't acknowledge that we're in pain, thus still the pain's there.
Yeah.
And so getting rid of it through massage was an acceptable manner, I guess. So I was responsible for giving her a massage. And then at one point, she would just start gossiping to me about all the things happening around us because she also really didn't have friends. And she told me about that happening. And she said something along the lines of, and I'm sure your grandmother still loves them in a very dismissive way. And being a child wanting desperately my mother's love, I immediately had panic about that. So I said something like, well, would you love me still if I weren't a Christian Scientist? And her response was, "Well, what are you?" And at the time, I didn't have a great name for what I was. I used Wiccan as an example, and I still play in some flavor of paganism for my ritual spaces because I deeply believe, like, ritual is a thing the brain needs, but whether or not it's magic or not, I just don't care. It brings me comfort, and that's all that matters. But at the time, I said Wicca. And she started talking about all the, bad things that Wicca supposedly is, like, "Oh, you just wanna fornicate in the woods and be naked in front of other people and do drugs and all these things." And I was like, "No, what? That's possible? I don't know. I just like the moon, it's pretty."
You're like, sounds
And
fun. Well, sign me up, right?
right, exactly. And so I like, that then spawned that, like, really hardcore suddenly I wasn't allowed to read anything that wasn't the Bible or Science and Health, and then it was also you're not allowed to be around your friends, and also, like, it got to a point where the control got so thorough, I wasn't allowed to be outside for more time than it took to leave to take the garbage out and come back in. Like, only for the necessity of my continued exploited labor around household duties. but even then it was thoroughly missed. And so that was kind of how I came out of the quote unquote broom closet, which also set the tone for later down the road how my siblings came out of the queer closets that they were in, much to my parents' chagrin. But I so that was how I exited, but then they immediately shoved me back in. So I was like 11 or so at that point, and it was double down. You have to go to church, but we're not gonna let you go to Sunday school anymore because you might toxify the other people there. You might get them to understand the lies that you're telling. So instead, you're gonna have to sit through service like an adult, and that was so boring. I would often end up napping, and then I would get punished for that. Also, a thing I did not know at the time, I was dissociating to the point of that, like, my primary coping mechanism was dissociation, and I would dissociate myself to sleep about it. So, the down the road a little bit, I think around 12 or 13 toward the end of being I'm a December baby, so toward the end of the year, our church was just failing. One of the actually kinda cool things about Christian Science churches is that they never build a church that's not fully paid off. So they never have, like, a mortgage or anything like that. They purchase the land, and then they figure out how much it's gonna cost to build like, structure, and then they pay that off, and then they build it. So, there was hardly any overhead, but our church was absolutely failing in regards to, like, how much money we had versus how much things like property taxes and, like, electricity and water were. So, they had also forced me to be part of the board of directors and pay my own personal money to be a member of the church because they wanted me to do the cult dance the right way. And then, I got to vote to close the church, and that was the best vote I ever cast for that stuff.
You
So,
didn't
we
have to
closed the church.
deliberate very long on that one, huh?
No, no, no. And then when the church closed, it was the only one near us. Like, there was another one that was a little bit closer, I think, technically, but it was a much smaller congregation even than the one that we had been in, and there wasn't a lot of community integration. So they were excited we were there, but we were still very like, "Ugh, I'm not so sure if these are our people." And so then it was my parents tried to create, like, "Let's do Sunday school at home," and, well, we've done this forever. My mother was a first reader and a second reader, which is like the stand-in for pastors. The second reader reads the Bible, and the first reader reads Science and Health. And then that just kinda fell through because frankly, my parents are pretty lazy. So, yeah.
That's
Yeah. Even your description of homeschool, I just have to say, like, so often it is just a way of covering for having children do at home labor. And there's just so many examples. And even I just think a lot of people who are homeschooling for ideological reasons don't really think through how much labor that is, how much responsibility you have to take. Like, it is so hard to properly homeschool someone. Like, it's a lot of work.
It is, and it's like, even with Calvert, so that I'm a person who has just a genuine love of learning. One of the reasons why I love being a massage therapist and coach is, like, there's never gonna be a point at which I know it all, and there will always be something to learn. And so, within, like, being homeschooled, Calvert was a phenomenal curriculum and was a private school in Baltimore, Maryland that we sent tests off to grade me. So it's more expensive, and eventually that my parents, for varying reasons, went into instead Rod and Staff, which is a terrible curriculum, but it's like when I have friends or colleagues that are like, "Oh, I'm considering homeschooling my child." I'm like, "Okay, understand it's a full-time job. There's a reason why we pay teachers to do it. And we pay them poorly, but it's a reason why it's a profession." And then also on top of that, if you're going to put your child into private school or homeschool, I really recommend you have external oversight because there is just the distinct possibility that your child might skeeve off. you will not be there all the time. You will sit them down to do their math homework or whatever, and they will pull out a like, that is just the reality. Like, your kid's gonna cheat sometimes, and if you're not watching them for that, it will happen, and their education will suffer for it. So unless you are willing, ready, and capable of handling all the obstacles in that, you are not ready to homeschool your kid.
What is the status of I was just gonna ask, what is the status of Christian Science churches nationally now? What does it look like for them?
Yeah, so I'm part of a Facebook group called Leaving Christian Science, or, ex Christian Science survivors, and, Leaving Christian Science is, the podcast that one of our members created, but, um, the last time I noted the numbers, it was something like 83 churches had closed over the last year, and the number of them that are growing or, like, being built for new congregations, like and many of those, it's like a new Christian Science society instead of a new church. So it's more like a church closed and a society grew. And, because those are like different, like, markers, like the difference between a village and a city.
Gotcha.
Um, and so
So it's fair to say that they are in decline.
incredibly, and so
Yeah,
much so that the ideology is changing. So, like, one of the things that is a more recent development is that now you can go to doctors. Now there's not this, like, oppressive pressure societally of, like, a bad thing about going to doctors. It's like, "Oh, no, 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 you just pray unless you have to, and then you can take your kids to the doctor." So, which, like, on some level, I'm like, "Look, hey, I'm glad that
yeah.
the kids are being less abused, and also I don't believe you."
And that's exactly what I was gonna say. Like, that's the same thing in the army. They're so gaslighty about it. You know, they're like, oh, of course, there's medical there all the time. We're just gonna call you names about it, like be mean to you if we're your boss, pretend like you're a slacker, all of this stuff, you know? And it's so interesting because I had heard about the medical stuff in the army, but I had never really experienced it. And then at one point in my career, I was salsa dancing and I took a knee to the spine, as one does. And I ended up with like a kind of like really entrenched back spasm that necessitated kind of 6 weeks of nothing. And so you have to get paperwork, right, in the military to be like, no, you can't make me work out. And immediately I started being treated like I was a dirtbag. And I was like, what? I
Well,
am famously like in super great physical shape in this unit at the time. And like the immediate way I started being treated like garbage because I needed medical care, you know, was shocking to me at the time. Of course, now it's a trend in all of them. And in this thing that you're saying, like, it's even sneakier in a way to be like, no, we don't say you can't anymore. You know, we're saying like you can do it.
Yeah, it's like they don't really ever talk about how, like, even in our congregation that I was raised in, one of the really horrific things that exists is, like, you're expected even as a child to not acknowledge the physical malady you can visually see. So, there are some stories that other members have of, like, watching someone have a cancerous growth on their face, and that cancerous growth getting worse and worse and worse until the person dies, and being expected to not be like, "What is happening?" And one of the very small examples of that in my personal experience is just that we had a person who had a essentially an eye twitch that she could not help, but while you're talking to her, her eyes would flick up as though she was rolling her eyes. And I'm late diagnosed autistic, so I did not understand. I was like, why is it okay for Miss M to roll her eyes at me and you never get mad at her for rolling her eyes? but I can't look away and look back without being told I rolled my eyes. And it was, "Oh, don't talk about Miss M's eye thing. She's praying about it." And that was just the cognitive dissonance was just so confusing, especially for myself, like, now knowing myself to be very logic and, like, rule oriented. I just wanna know what's happening, explain it, and there's no explaining cult ideology without a thought terminating cliche. It's not possible.
So, what was part of your healing? What did that look like? Where are you now?
Yeah,
What did that take us through that process? Because I think that's very helpful for
yeah.
others, and so much of your experiences resonate with what I experienced, with what Daniela experienced, and I'm sure what countless others have experienced as well.
Yeah, a lot of it came down to, 2020 kind of shaking me out of my stupor in a way. So I, met my partner, we met on online dating, and he rescued me out of the hellhole I lived in, and, he didn't realize how culty the space was, although there were some resounding red flags that are quite funny if you wanna hear those stories. The best one is, I don't know, Daniela, if you've run into the Christian Science Lord's Prayer, like the translation? No? Oh my god. Okay, sorry. That is, like, my favorite little cult trick to play. Let me quickly pull that up because I don't remember it off the top of my head. It's one of the things I'm glad to have fully eradicated. But
So this
the
was a prayer that they would recite when you gathered together, or
Yeah, so it would the way that, services would go was that the first reader would read from Science and Health, and the second reader would read from the Bible. We're adamant that Christian Science follows the Bible and that the, Science and Health just explains what the Bible says. Let's see, Lord's Prayer. So um, the first reader would say the translation. So it would go second reader, "Our Father which art in heaven," and then the first reader would say, "Our Father, Mother God, all harmonious. Hallowed be thy name, adorable one. Thy kingdom come. Thy kingdom is come. Thou art ever present. Thy will be done in on earth as it is in heaven. Enable us to know, as in heaven, so on earth. God is omnipotent, supreme. Give us this day our daily bread. Give us grace for today. Feed the famished affections. And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And love is reflected in love. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And God leadeth us not into temptation, but delivereth us from sin, disease, and death. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. For God is infinite, all power, all life, truth, love, over all and all. So what's hilarious about that is that my partner is Christian. He's very much like, "This is a great book that gives you an idea of how to be a good person." Very much not the indoctrination that we're experiencing now, like, as a society. And I had shared that with my parents. I'm like, "Oh, well, he's Christian," because 'cause they're like, "Oh, well, are you guys gonna get along because 'cause you're some kind of witch?" And I was like, we've had conversations and we're actually on the same page about most stuff." So the first time he comes over to our house where I was living at the time at 19, or yeah, 18, almost 19, my mother all of a sudden, without any prompting, tells my youngest sibling to go and get the little plaque that hangs on the wall in their bedroom that has this prayer with the back and forth. And she's expecting us to do the Lord's Prayer part, and so we're like, "Our Father which art in heaven." We had never, ever in our entire lives done prayer before a meal. And just all of the sudden, because we're playing for another Christian, we're doing a dance now, we have to prove how Christian people do it, and now we have to pray in front of the new person at the table.
And it's interesting, right? That every group does this. The Bible is problematic in and of itself if you just read it prima facie on its face. But then you add the interpretation, and they never trust people just to read the Bible,
Right.
because if they did, they might come up with a conclusion that contradicts the doctrine or the leaders. So that's where the rub comes in with all of these groups. They have to have somebody who is set up as the guru to call balls and strikes and to say, no, that's acceptable, that's not acceptable. And that's exactly what they were doing there with the Lord's Prayer.
Absolutely. It was, and even in that translation, it's freaking gibberish.
Yeah,
It doesn't make any sense. What does it, you need a translation for the translation.
absolutely.
And so, and that's like the whole word salady thing. I am very much of the opinion that Mary Baker Eddy was inherently also a narcissist. Like there's so many, like so much evidence, so many stories to underline that likelihood. But yeah, so like there were just so many warnings. So then my partner and I moved in together. I moved out of my parents' house, leaving my 3 siblings at home, which was its own like challenge because I was aware this is an abusive household. I was a teenager, like having conversations with friends and them going, that's not normal. That's not okay that they do that to you, that they hurt you that way. Like I mentioned earlier, getting aspirin smuggled in by my best friend. That was a challenge, and I had to hide that like it was porn. Like, it was hard to keep that hidden from the other 2 siblings that stayed in the same bedroom as me. So, I, moved in with my partner, and then we just ran into the challenges that new partners run into together, right? Like, how are bills gonna get paid? Who's doing the dishes? Disagreements and arguments. And while we have never been at all volatile to or at each other, I would find myself anytime he was upset, just like flinching away. And that caused him reasonably deep hurt and anger because he's like, I have never and would never hurt you or hit you. Why are you doing that? And I was like, I don't know. And so I just got through it. I had friends who went to therapy, could not afford it myself, and got through some of that, worked through some of that just by being a person and trying again. And then in 2020, when shit hit the fan with COVID, we were living with roommates who are still dear and good friends of ours. And everyone has their own life experiences and stuff like that. I am a person who has the capacity to be very messy and cluttery, partially because I was raised also by hoarders. The layers are just so many. So I don't really see clutter the way most people see clutter. My brain just kind of fogs and fuzzes over it and doesn't really notice it until my partner goes, "This is driving me crazy. Can we please fix this?" But my roommates were a little more cluttery than we were, and we're a little more lax with like, "Yeah, we can do the dishes tomorrow." So my partner working nights came home one day and had to wash dishes in order to make dinner and all that stuff. I came into the space to seeing a man, because my partner is AMAB, seeing a man with some level of palatable frustration. Like I could tell he was frustrated with work or life or whatever, washing dishes. And that, from a trauma perspective, everything is pattern recognition, right? So I like to use the example of one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish from Dr. Seuss. It's like once you hear the first couple, your brain kind of autofills the rest, but it's more one fish, two fish, red fish, I'm dying. And so I saw these multiple factors, a person washing the dishes, they're a man, they're angry, hearing the clinking of the dishes and hit a PTSD spiral. Not aware of what that was at the time, not fully at least. And instead of melting down in front of him, I ran and yelled at our roommates for failing to take care of the thing preemptively. Thankfully, they understand me as a person very well and also were present to that this was an out of character moment. Got my partner sat me down and was like, "This is not okay. I can't come home having had a bad day and just have had a bad day. You inherently make it about you, and that means I can't be angry, and that's about life. That's not about issues in our relationship." And I went, "Yeah, you're right. I see that pattern too. I think I need therapy." And so then, thankfully, I had some phenomenal therapy. I had one kind of shitty therapist, and then I had 2 really, really phenomenal therapists, one of whom I'm still with. The Both of them helped me a lot. The first one that was really good used a lot of CBT, DBT, so, cognitive behavioral and dialectical behavioral therapy, and, she helped me see, like, the fallacy, like, the incorrectness of the pattern. Yeah, sure, the pattern historically existed, but does this person ever show that pattern? And I'm like, "Oh, no, that's right. That's a good point, because I
And
wouldn't
isn't
tolerate
isn't
that."
it isn't it amazing how these patterns magnify themselves? All of us, right? We all bring baggage into our relationships and into our adult lives. But those of us that grew up in cults and in high control groups like this, it seems to be magnified. And for me, the way that it shows up is that everything is ultra intense, right? There's no ordinary or normal moments because if there are, I get bored very easily and I'm always chasing the next high. I'm always chasing the adrenaline. And growing up in a Pentecostal setting, that makes sense because every Sunday was hyper intensive. We had to break through, we had to pray through, we had to win the world for Christ, all of this pressure. And so now in my adult life, I tend to put a lot of pressure on those that are around me to make everything exciting and exuberant and intense and over the top when the reality is most of life isn't like that.
Yeah, and most of life is and should be pretty boring.
There you go.
And so I did therapy with that person, that therapist for about 2 years or so, and then she was pregnant and was like, "I'm gonna be taking 9 months off, so you can either wait for me or go find someone else in the meantime." And then I had been doing my own work, doing massage therapy professionally, and was realizing, like, how many of my clients were literally holding physical structures from psychological issues. There were some pretty visceral examples of that in my practice that I was working in a clinic at the time, and so I just started reading every book I could get my hands on trauma and on somatic therapies and all this stuff. And, because of that, I ran into internal family systems, which is, developed by Richard Schwartz, and, got access to his books, and then I found a therapist who specializes in IFS, EMDR, and sand tray as a combination. And that has been, without a doubt, one of the biggest impacts for me on my trauma. I had a session yesterday and we reflected on even just the last year of therapy together and how rapidly I have changed, not because who I am is different, but because who I am is healed. I'm exactly who I was always going to be. I have always been a very compassionate and empathetic individual who is very smart and very capable. I just believe it now.
Yeah.
And within that, it's that using IFS and EMDR, I've been able to go back to the child parts of me that sit in my soul and my memory and my psyche, and also address literally the neurological wiring that was embedded in my psyche when it was developing. Gone and created new spaces to sit alongside what actually happened so that the need that was unmet then is met now. So that I can truly say that is in the past. That is no longer happening in my current. Because that's one of the challenges with trauma is that there's this fear it's gonna happen again. And when you go down that fear spiral, you start to feel like you were in that moment that the bad thing happened and you didn't have your need met. And most of the time, the need that was not met was understanding. Just a person to get that you're having an experience, that experience sucks. I'm here, you're not alone. Like that there are other needs, especially physiological ones that just weren't present, but integrating that happened, it was real, you did go through that, and then also it is no longer happening. That is the gap that often exists, especially with CPTSD. So, within that, I am now at a point in my life where when I get triggered, I am able to go, "Ooh, that is not who I am." Person, like, comes at me about my professional credentials, and I go, "Ooh, I wanna fight them in a Wendy's parking lot." And I go, "Ooh, I'm not a person who actually does that, though. I don't actually like wanting to throw down with a person, it doesn't make me feel good about myself. What's happening?" And then I can turn inward and find the part of me, often usually a teenager, who is afraid of being seen as a fake. And it's like, "Okay, hey kiddo, what's up? Oh, you're not a kiddo, my bad. You are almost an adult." And then speaking on with this piece of my psyche and going, "So what are you worried about?" And that part of my psyche going, "Well, I'm worried that they're gonna say I'm lying or that they're not gonna believe me about my life." I'm like, "Okay, we don't care actually. If other people disagree that your life experience was your life experience, um,
Yeah. And
that's
let me
not your
tell
problem."
you, you can have a book that is being reviewed as very well researched and like all the credentials you want, and people will still tell you it's not enough.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm still very much dealing with that one, Emily. Good on you for calling it out. Like I still want to just like smash people every time they're questioning the credentials. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and it's my professional education is in massage therapy. I know I can say, "Look, I have this license that says I'm a licensed massage therapist." You can go talk to the Department of Licensing and Regulation about that if you have a problem. But everything else of my experience is information I've absorbed or my personal lived experience. And so there are people who validly challenge my personal education in that vein. And also, I'm not saying I'm educated in it. I'm saying I have information on it. And if you want that information for yourself, I can give you the 50 plus books I've read about it and the studies I cite about it in my presentations. And you can go acquire the same information yourself. I'm not putting a wall up that like I'm some super important person. I'm just a person. And if you have a problem with me, you probably actually have a problem with yourself, and I'm the person you're just looking at.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love your explanation of that because I always say, like, to me, this is the difference between like someone who's an actual expert on something and someone who's a guru on something. Is first of all, if you can show up and give expert level information, like you're an expert, awesome. And second of all, if you're an expert in something, every expert I've ever met in anything can tell me how they acquired that expertise, whether that is through a school or through reading 50 books on this thing. Like right now, oh, this is actually a perfect time to announce this. I'm writing a new book on fascism. And I know, right? It's called An All American Fascism. I've already posted a little bit on my Patreon. I'm going to share it a chapter at a time, but it's like, I'm doing this research. I'm building it, of course, on my cult expertise. And like I start the book off telling you about how cults and fascism are related. But I'm like, no, by the time I'm done with this, I'm gonna be somewhat of an expert on fascism, especially American fascism. But right now,
Right.
like this is just a project that I'm choosing to do. And I think I honestly think that like this is part of our job in the world, us ADHD people, is to go do all the learning and then just package it for other people, you know?
Yeah,
because we're
exactly.
so good at
And,
that.
like yeah, and it's one of those things that it's like, I'm so grateful for Uncultured because it was a big part of me going, "I have way too many same-sames for this to be a normal childhood experience." And then also, like, while I myself did not go through the military, there are parts of your military experience that I see being similar to my upbringing. That, like, the way I phrased it to a friend recently is I was like, "Oh, no, I'm really excited. My siblings are gonna be coming down to visit me. We'll all 4 of us be together in one space for the first time in a couple of years in January." And I'm really excited because 'cause I'm like, "I can't wait to share war stories together again," because that is what it
Yes.
felt like. Like, we
Yes.
survived war.
Yes. Well,
And
like, I did, this is part of what I'm liking about writing the musical is that I think like the cult babies and the veterans like relate to both sides of the thing. Like I've written my Have a Day song, which is a song about how hard it is to be like a young army officer that's expected to mask all the time and be perfect. But like all of my kids that grew up as little baby soldiers for Christ like also relate to that. And it's like to me that just shows that it is that there's this generic experience that is all the same. And by the way, as you were talking, I've been basically wondering if we're the same person. So I'm glad you related to my book so
I'm so
well.
glad the parasocial relationship goes a little both ways. I really enjoy watching your little exposés all the time. It's something that I share in my activism circles on a regular basis. Be like, "Hey guys, this is just the cult experience coming out. This is just the reality we're in, and you can just acknowledge that and stop making it your fault."
Emily, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been so helpful and encouraging, so much information that I think all of us that grew up in similar situations can apply to our lives. So thank you for sharing your story. We really appreciate having you on.
Thank you guys so much for facilitating this space. It has been really enjoyable for me as well.
And Emily, how
Absolutely.
do listeners get in touch with you?
If they'd like to email me, my professional email is Emily H at Holistic Echoes, HOLISTICECHOES.com. Like I said before, I'm a massage therapist and coach. I work out of South Houston. If you go to holisticechoes.com, you can get access to my coaching and or to my massage therapy spaces if you'd like to do that. I'd love to see other clients, but no pressure. Like, if I'm right for you, I'm right for you, and if I'm not, then I will help you find what's right for you. It's all good.
Love that. And we will
Thank
share
you so
those
much.
links
Yeah.
in our show notes.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And to all of our listeners, if Emily mentioned Daniela's book Uncultured, if you haven't read that, what are you doing? What are you waiting for? Because
For real.
it is a great book. And also the Culting of America is coming out in January. Is that right, Daniela?
January 20th. And of course, don't forget to check out Scott's book,
The
Was
God I Was
Given. Yeah,
Given.
that's right.
Yes.
I get mixed up with your subtitle because I love the subtitle.
Yeah, looking for faith after losing my religion, and I appreciate that so much. And yeah, all of us are writing, and that's a great way to interact with us. Also, if you're listening to the podcast, do us a favor and hit that like button, that subscribe button. Leave a review, share it with a friend or family member, someone who you think could benefit from the information that helps spread the word about what we're doing on this podcast. So thank you all for listening. Emily, thank you once again for being with us and sharing your story. And until next time, I'm Scott Loyd for Daniela Mestenek Young, Knitting Cult Lady. We'll see you on the next episode of Cults and the Culting of America podcast.
Have a day.